So when I was talking to Andrew about coming out here and what to discuss, I talked about hard things and all these hard things that we've been working on with my company. And the background here is, so we just finished with Y Combinator and things are actually good, but I'm going to talk about all the terrible, terrible things of the last 3 years of the company. So he's saying, we need to talk about the hard things, particularly in regulated industries like healthcare. And I was like, well, I can do that. I can definitely talk about the hard, unglamorous things that come from running a startup. I'm going to use some notes because I'm a little jet lagged. And I come by my interest in hard problems naturally, I would say, from this guy. This is a photo of my father, very old, 1980s, you can tell from the mustache. So he passed away several years ago, and he raised me pretty much on his own. And he was a very good father, but he was a very unsentimental man. And when I was a child, like many children, I would get a little frustrated sometimes, and I would cry. And so my father would sort of look at me with his unsentimental gaze, and he would say, "Oh, poor baby, someone broke into the house and stole all the easy problems and left you only with the hard problems." Now, as a child, I didn't find that particularly comforting, but I will say it instilled in me a belief that hard problems were to be faced, not feared. So I'd like to think that's what I've carried forward into this adventure. So what I did is I grew up and I went to the university and I became a professor. Now, what wasn't said in the intro is that my degree is actually in literature, even though I am a professor of engineering. But that's a totally different story. So for the last 20 years, I've been teaching at universities and doing all kinds of work, like I studied early internet initiatives around the world. I looked at patterns of technology use in different countries. I lived in Uzbekistan for a while. I looked at issues of infrastructure and technology development. I looked at some early financial, mobile payment systems, M-Pesa, which started in Kenya. So did research on all kinds of things with great students who built amazing prototypes. We worked on healthcare technologies. Increasingly, that became a focus. Learned how to do research around the world to really build things that people would love. Looking at all the sort of general context, engaging with users in a variety of settings. I also did a project about innovation and hackerspaces at the university and figuring out how to bring those two things together. That was kind of a hard project. And then this is one of the projects that I worked on for a few years, and I'll talk about a little bit more. So this is a portable ultrasound. This is by GE. I did not make this. But what we did work on is how to turn this machine into something as simple as this. And the story of that project is that it failed. And that's really what propelled me to start a company. So universities are very, very good at many things, but they are not good at everything. And one of the things that they do is they put knowledge into silos. They're great places for research, for teaching, for learning, for mentoring, but they're not really good places for commercializing technologies that disrupt ways of doing business. I believe in universities. I think they're exquisite institutions and they're key for human progress, so I just want to make that clear. But for the kind of work that we were doing in my lab, and a lot of my colleagues were doing as well, we're really focusing on markets outside the US, people, not the 1%, right, but the rest of the world. A lot of business models, particularly in healthcare, made it really hard to think of anything low cost as being commercially viable. So what we needed to do was, figure out how to make that work. And the example for that is, so in the US system, universities will often commercialize intellectual property that comes out of faculty members' labs. And they sort of hand that to an executive team to go and execute on. And that model is great if you're doing business as usual. But if you're trying to do something different, it doesn't work so hard. So that ultrasound example that I told you about, so we went to Uganda, we went to Kenya, we were working with a radiologist, we had money from Gates, we had money from the GE Foundation. We built this amazingly simple prototype. And the midwives loved it, and we brought it to the university and we said, okay, we think that there's a market for this. And they said, well, this doesn't really look like intellectual property to us because the innovation is all around design. I thought, well, okay. So then we went to go to see Philips and GE and a bunch of other ultrasound manufacturers, and we said to them, well, here, we published on this, we're academics, you should just take it and use it. It's free, we'll give you our data. And they said, no, thank you. Actually, they said, no, thank you a lot, because we went back a lot. And finally, there was a VP who took me aside, and he said, you know, we could make cheaper technology, but it wouldn't support the cost of our sales force, so we have no motivation to do so. And I thought, well, that sounds like a broken model, because the world's changed a lot, and are you sure you can't do things differently? And that was probably the day that I decided to start a company. But what I began to realize from the story of that ultrasound, and also looking at all the other things that either were in my lab or other faculty members' labs, not just at, at institutions around the world, is that great ideas are not the same as impact. So the gap between those two is actually huge. And I decided that was the really hard problem that I wanted to work on. How do you take ideas and have them actually turn into products that can have impact in the world and improve people's lives? So I, confronted the career limitations of being in the university. And it turns out that 20 years as a professor qualifies you to do absolutely nothing. So my only choice was to start a company. And I credit that desperation with why I persisted for 3 years and began what I affectionately refer to as my Startup Slog. And I chose the word slog, even though it's a little bit of an unusual word in English, because it's so perfect to explain what it is, this kind of the hard thing that we're trying to do. And it's, even though it's boring or it's difficult, just sort of being steady and determined and going slowly. So the company is Shift Labs, and we started with the ideas in 2011 and incorporated in 2012. And it took 3 years to raise our first dollar. And we had a physical manufactured product on the market before we could convince any investors to give us money. And in retrospect, it's because we did pretty much everything wrong. But we're still alive. The goal of the company is to build very simple and affordable healthcare devices that will improve care worldwide. We acknowledge that the US healthcare market is so incredibly broken that we pretty much avoid US hospitals and think about markets elsewhere. And I'm not going to talk about our products. At the end, I'll talk a little bit about one of our products, but I really want to talk about sort of the difficult aspects of doing a hardware company in regulated industries. Part of what we're also doing with the company is building viable business models, particularly for a regulated industry that lacks any incentive structure for lower cost products. So one of the reasons we do what we do, and that we've persisted, is because we believe that innovation can really serve greater goals. Of justice maybe not isn't the best word, it's maybe equality or equity, but not the stock option kind. But basically there are technological solutions that can make a profound difference in people's lives, but they need business models to actually bring them into the world. These are the great ideas that clutter up faculty labs or the garages of makers, or even clinics around the world where doctors have created homegrown solutions. We also think that everyone in the world should be able to get great health care. Like there's no structural reason why that can't happen. And the things that we build are really about simple solutions. So we're not talking about like crazy, really sexy technological things like 3D printing organs or nano robots in the blood, because those things are super cool, but they're not what we do. So well, we're not going to spend 5 years in the lab doing an R&D. We want to take existing technology, reconfigure it in really simple, elegant ways. So that's really important to say, because I'm actually secretly a Luddite. I don't actually think technology can solve the world, but I think we can do better in terms of what we do with the technologies we have. So when I was putting together this talk, I found this great website that had all these inspirational quotes, many of which I'll share. And some of them I read and I was like, you know what, I just don't believe that. Because sometimes you can work really, really hard and things don't work out. So I may be an optimist, but I'm also a realist. So I'm not really sure I believe these quotes, but I definitely believe this one. So startup land is great when you're crushing it, but most days I think most people, certainly I, feel crushed by it. But great things come into the world because people don't stop. They keep going. So what I'm going to go through now are some of the challenges that we faced. So the first one is pretty personal. The lighting is pretty good here, so you might not realize it, but I have more wrinkles than the typical entrepreneur. I am old by entrepreneur standards. I can't do anything about that. I suppose I could have plastic surgery, not willing to. But increasingly, the research that people have done, so the Kauffman Foundation did some research, Founder Institute, Duke University, there have been a series of studies. Eileen Lee from Cowboy Ventures did a study about unicorns, really digging into preconceptions about founders and founder age. And what they've all found is that actually the average age of founders is around 40, and that founders who are over 50 are 2 times as successful as founders who are under 25, which is pretty good. And people over 55 are 2 times as likely to launch high-growth startups as people under 35 are. So don't give up if you're old. So then there's the issue of co-founding. So I started my company with 3 people, none of whom are still with the company. So 2 left within the first 6 weeks. The other one, we worked together for a couple years, very congenial. His wife had a baby, he needed to go get a real job, and we were not getting any funding. And so that was sort of a challenge, but it was this notion of, do we just separate? We had no money, how was someone else gonna come into the company with no funding? And that was super stressful. And it was about taking the leap. And it's kind of like when you break up with someone and you don't know if you're gonna date anyone else. But it was totally worth taking the risk, and it took 6 months, but now I have an awesome co-founder. Then there's the ever-popular fundraising story. So how many people in here have ever tried to raise money for a company? Really? Only one? Either that or everyone else is napping. So like I said, we just finished up with Y Combinator, and things are really great now, so I feel like I can tell these stories publicly. But we had terrible experiences trying to raise money. All of the all the horror stories that you hear about, they really happen. And for example, I had pitched to an angel group in Seattle, and it went really well. It's a good pitch. Had a due diligence meeting with 4 of the investors, and then they all went dark. So I ran into someone from the group, not one of the 4, but someone else from the group. I ran into him at some reception, and I said, I probably won't say his name because it's being recorded. So I said, hey, do you have any advice for me from the pitch that you saw? I'm just making conversation at a cocktail party. And he walked up to me and he literally shook his finger in my face right here and said, giving your company money is the stupidest thing I could do with my money. I might as well burn it. I'd be better off giving it away because at least I'd get a tax advantage. Which is fair if he feels that way. I didn't ask him for money. He was just rude, right? There's no reason he couldn't have just walked away. Then there were the 2 investors who committed to giving us, they were on board to give us $100,000 each, and we were about to run out of money, shutting down. And so we'd gotten into an incubator in San Francisco, and we were trying to decide whether we should take the offer. And the focus was on manufacturing, and we sort of had manufacturing figured out, so we're like, well, we don't know if it's a great fit, and so we called them up and we said, are you in? Because if you're in, we'll stay here. If you're not, we're going to go down to we're going to take the money and we're going to go down to San Francisco. They said, we're in, we're absolutely in, and we'd been dancing with them for months. And so the next day they sent back the term sheet, it was a convertible note, and they said, well, we'll put in half the money, so a total of $100,000. They were originally going to put in 100 each. They said, we'll give you half the money, and then you have 30 days to hire an electrical engineer, a marketing person, file your FDA application, and do a new business plan and financial models. I said, I don't really think I can hire 2 people with $100,000 in the bank. And they said, oh, sure you can. And so it devolved from there. And then we were out of money. And so there's more stories, some of which I won't tell specifically, but what I will say is gender matters in fundraising. And so there was another incident with an investor who asked me, imagine the most inappropriate personal question you could ask an entrepreneur, and that's what he asked me. And then imagine the second most personal, intrusive, inappropriate question you could ask an entrepreneur, and he asked me that one too. And because it's a small community, I felt like I couldn't say anything, and I sat there and took it in silence. And it was terrible. It was probably the low point. And the lesson from that, I'd say there's a couple lessons about gender. First of all, it's learning to push back and recognizing how inappropriate. And he had the he had the presence of mind or the clarity of thought when he asked one of these incredibly inappropriate questions. He said, look, if you were a man, I know this wouldn't matter, but you're a woman, so it does. I know it's not fair. And it was not a question about kids, by the way. It was truly inappropriate. So learning to push back on those inappropriate questions, I think, is really essential. I know there are people who say that gender doesn't matter. I'd love to sit down and have a drink with them. I think it does matter, but it's not an excuse not to do things. I mean, that's ultimately what it boils down to, and it's learning to do things differently. Similarly, when I started doing this, I had a mentor who said, you need to stop sounding like a professor. I was like, I am a professor. I don't know how to stop. It's like, well, you need to find different ways to talk, different versions of yourself to bring to the table. And I think of gender in the same way. Like, what are the demands on women? How are they different? And bringing those to the table, dealing with people. I mentioned earlier that we're working on new business models. And what we found is that we get a lot of no's. And the no's are fine, because we get enough yeses. And we are trying to do something different. And for us, learning to work with distributors is really key. And if you don't want to do things differently, we're not the people that you should be working with. So we first started selling a product in the veterinary market. But while we were sort of waiting for that clearance, for the regulatory clearance, and what we found is the vet market is a great place to experiment because people are very friendly. And we're making all the mistakes in a nice, safe market that's not part of our core constituency. But we look for patterns in the distributor relationships of people who are going to help us, who are going to give us that leg up. So whether it's companies that are smaller, hungrier, have people in charge who are younger, who have that sort of visibility into, hey, we can do things differently. So we've really learned to accept sort of relationships for what they are, in places where the people are willing to do work with us, but also putting the effort into building new relationships. So sales is also super hard. A friend of mine who had a successful hardware company, I called him up one day and I was sort of stressing about our sales. I said, we're sucking at sales. And he said, everyone sucks at sales. And he had just sold his company for like $600 million. So I felt emboldened by that. A couple weeks ago, Jessica Livingston, one of the founders of YC, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and she was talking about how founders should focus more on sales rather than marketing. But sales are part of that slog. Sales is where you go out and you talk to your customers and you find out why they hate your product or they love it. But those are really difficult conversations to have because in every conversation you're super vulnerable. Nobody really wants to do that. It's much easier to put together a marketing plan and go broad. But that deep customer engagement, getting in your car and driving around and cold calling people. I did that for 2.5 months during YC. I just walked into vet clinic after home health agency, just complete cold calls. Brutal. It's a slog, but it's totally essential. And then you get to the point where your sales go up and then they go down, and then they go up, and then they go down, and they go up, and then they go down again. It's terrifying. We're on the downward curve right now. It is. It's terrifying. All you do is keep going. Okay, so this is my favorite on dealing with regulated markets. Often, people use regulation as an excuse not to innovate. I'm just going to put that out there. It is hard, but with persistence, you can grind away at those barriers. There's two really key pieces of information here. When it comes, particularly in the medical market, when it comes to regulation, there's this sense that it always costs millions of dollars and it's going to take 5 to 10 years. The fact is, our product is it's not pharma, it's not a new drug. We didn't have to do any human trials, we didn't have to do any animal trials, we had to do bench testing. It's actually not always that hard to introduce innovative products into the medical space. That said, it's a completely opaque process. So we hired consultants, and it was still incredibly difficult to figure out even what to put together for both the FDA and the CE marking to sell in Europe. There's no reason for the lack of transparency. And so actually this is one of the things that we're committed to, is making available our documents and our processes and helping other entrepreneurs figure out how to navigate regulated markets and how to not let them be a barrier. So prototyping, also really hard. Again, we had no money. Someone gave us a 3D printer, which was great. My mantra was to beg, borrow, and steal. Actually, not so much steal, but definitely begging and borrowing. So going from this, to this, to this, to this, and then an actual physical product. But it's really hard. So this one we actually had taken to India, and this was one of the best failures, I guess you could say, that we had. There was a fundamental design flaw in this product that we would not have discovered had we not taken it to a variety of markets. So that's great, but how do you do that when you don't have any money? Because, like I said, we had no money. So we sort of took some more YC advice to be James Bond or be Wiley. If someone would invite me to give a talk somewhere, I would tack on some field study. I went on vacation, and I'm not really proud to say that I took a couple days out of my vacation and visited medical clinics. This was in Latin America. When we had friends and colleagues traveling, we would give them devices to go and test out, and then we would have them leave them with hospital networks, and then we would Skype later with people. Like, we did all of these things in order to get feedback, acknowledging that we had no money. The other thing that we did is we used our social network. So I did, both when I was an academic, but also I used to do consulting in international development. So I had this network around the world, and I just reached out to that network, anyone that I thought might be able to help and might have connections in the healthcare field. Our chief medical officer is based in Uganda, and he's got contacts all over the world. We just used that network as much as we could. So then there's manufacturing, which, if you're a hardware company, is probably the fastest way to die. So the thing about manufacturing is it's not rocket science when it comes to figuring out the math behind it, but much like rocket science, it is very likely to kill you if you do it wrong. So my co-founder is amazing when it comes to manufacturing and managing supplier relationships. There are two big takeaways when it comes to manufacturing. So for startups that don't have a lot of in-house expertise, like having an industrial designer and a mechanical engineer and an embedded systems engineer, and having all those people is expensive. So what a lot of companies do is they outsource the engineering design, they outsource the design for manufacturing, and they outsource assembly. And I think that's a terrible idea, because you lose that tight connection with your product in those early days when it's essential. So I had this great co-founder who could manage all these supplier relations, and then we built the first 500 ourselves. We got our friends into the office. It wasn't fun, it was a slog, but we understood the product so much better, and now we know, as we've already redesigned it in order to make assembly so much easier. And it was only because we sat and built 500 ourselves that we could do that work. And then when it comes to outsourcing, so we have a contract manufacturer now. They're just outside Seattle. They could handle all of the supplier relationships. for a 20% markup for all of our components. But we don't do that. It's super unglamorous to sit there and send emails back and forth and POs and negotiate with all of those suppliers. But we're a startup, and it saves us 20% on all of those components. And it's one of the ways that we've really been able to stay alive. So disruption. So, in those early days when you're building a disruptive technology, it's the same thing as sounding crazy. And we are legitimately trying to change some entrenched ways of doing business. I can't stand here and say, I know for sure it will work. So far so good. People do like what we've built, and we have good margins on our physical product. We are almost through the FDA. But new ideas sound crazy for some time. So basically, embrace the crazy. So for us throughout the slog, before we had funding, when it was just my co-founder, Koji, and I trying to get everything done, and we're trying to get the product to market with sort of zero cash, it was this notion of what can we do each day to feel like we can keep going. So we could talk to a customer or do a user test. We could 3D print a mold and then hand pour resin to try out a new attachment mechanism. Like, there were small things that we could do each day that would bring us closer to where we wanted to be in the world. And those incremental steps are what gave us the strength to go on to the next step. So 3 years, or 3.5 years that it took to get funding. And ultimately, this is what drives us to keep going. So there's... I'm not really sure what you just said. Okay. I was rushing through because I was told I was out of time, but now I have time. Okay. So every day, this is what keeps us going as we struggle. We think about the market, and we think about the opportunity, and we think about the people in the world that we want to reach with our products. And the impact, ultimately the impact that we want to have. And all of those great ideas that are withering away in labs around the world, how can we bring those into the world as actual products that can improve lives? And so what you see behind you is tiny little slice of the global healthcare market is U.S. hospitals. And there's a ton of research attention and money that goes into really high-end solutions for that market. And that is not what we're paying attention to. There should be a big X through that green slice of pie. It's that rest of the world. So it's about 900 billion versus 5.6 trillion. Sort of recognizing that there's this large market that just isn't the focus of a lot of attention is what keeps us going. Okay, so now I'll tell you a little bit about what we do, just very quickly. So this is an infusion set. So in a hospital, if you're getting drugs or fluids, in a U.S. hospital at least, you are almost always going to be on an infusion pump, this thing here. It's what makes sure you get the right amount of medication or drugs. But in most of the world, actually the vast majority of infusions every day are given by hand. And let's go back and look at that one. So what this means is there's a doctor or a nurse, usually a nurse, who's staring at that drip chamber up there and counting the drops as they fall, each one. And then they do mental math in their head to convert the drop rate into a flow rate to make sure you get the right amount of drugs. And they almost always make a big mistake. So this is what we built. No, we didn't build that. We built this, which is an inexpensive flow meter that will fit on pretty much any infusion drip set. And it runs off one AA battery, and instead of having to count the drops by hand and do mental math, it will count for you and do precision calculation. And then it will sound an alarm if the rate changes. It's an incredibly simple solution. It is not rocket science. A lot of the innovation is around design. There are proprietary algorithms. And a question I get a lot, and I have gotten a lot from investors, is, well, why doesn't this exist? It does exist, actually, in India and China. There are versions that are notorious for not working well. Turns out it's a very hard problem to solve. But one of the reasons it doesn't exist is much for the same reason that portable ultrasound wasn't interesting to any of the companies that we talked with. It's low cost, doesn't have high margins. It would not support the cost of a high-touch sales force. And so that eventually is what the new business models are that we're building, so that devices like this can be financially viable, and can help save lives around the world. So we are a startup, and every day is an opportunity to die, but we're not dead yet. So thank you. Are there any questions?
Ooh, okay, there we go. Really sorry about that. No, we have time, actually a lot of time. So, any questions? Someone? Ella?
So, as you're selling already, and I know a bit more about what's happening with the company. So, like, what's like the most interesting hack you came up with, or maybe tell us about the hack or the market that you discovered that you didn't think existed.
So from the sales perspective, there's probably two. So the first is the veterinarians. So we didn't think that we were going to sell this to vets. We just wanted to sell to the human market. But there was a vet distributor who found us online and said, we think the vet market would really like this. So we went to one of the big vet trade shows. This is about a year and a half ago. And it was we still hadn't manufactured. It was in a still late stage prototype. And we were actually trying to decide, were we just going to build 50 and bring them into the field, like in the developing world? But we went to the vet market, and people really loved it, and we did a bunch of price acceptability testing, and they were willing to pay more than we would have imagined. So we said, well, let's make 500 and sell them to the vets, which is essentially our beta testers paying for the privilege. So we loved that. The other hack is, literally comes out of a hackathon. So last autumn, during the height of the Ebola outbreak, we got a request from some of our friends at the IMAI-IMCI Alliance. And they were running Ebola, they were creating curriculum for the WHO for all the doctors and nurses that were traveling to West Africa to volunteer. And they asked if we could help with some interactive training modules to supplement the classroom training. And there was no money for the project, so we did a hackathon and brought in a bunch of game developers and designers from the Seattle area who I knew from previous academic research, and so had a weekend hackathon and built a prototype of of an immersive VR training environment. So that was great. It was in the hands of the Alliance to figure out what to do with next. But someone at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy heard about it and reached out. And so I was on the phone with them telling them about the hackathon, and I mentioned the Drip Assist. And one of them said, well, the U.S. Agency for International Development has a grant competition for Ebola, and the deadline is today. Why don't you hang up and write an application for that? So we did, and we got it. So now we have a bunch of non-dilutive funding to go and ruggedize our device for Ebola, which is great. Although I'm not super excited about going into an ETU. But what that did is it meant that we ended up at the WHO. So they invited us to a meeting at the WHO, and UNICEF was there, and a bunch of other international organizations who have now expressed interest in purchasing it. And what's great about that is it's an incredible validation pathway for us for all kinds of customers around the world. And we would have assumed that we couldn't go to those international players until later, because they're usually very slow purchasers. But this sort of weird Byzantine pathway got us a seat at the table in Geneva, and that was great.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, so I'm curious, the process for sort of iterating a software product is pretty well known and easy. You can just sort of build a small improvement, release it to users. If they like it, you keep it. If they don't, you roll it back. I'm curious how you manage iterations on a hardware product.
Poorly. It's really hard. We can't update over the air our software, which you can do with some hardware products. So we're really careful about when we release. Because we're working in the medical space, we have to be incredibly accurate. So the compromise for us is in the user experience, not the accuracy. I mean, it has to be that way. from a form factor standpoint, what we do is a ton of user testing. So we bring users in, I think, earlier in the design process than conventionally happens. And we do that for two reasons. One is I come from a human-centered design background, and I believe this is important for product design. But the other is it's expensive to make 500 or 3,000 units, and we don't want to screw it up. So we try really hard to build in a ton of user testing, both on the physical design as well as our software. We're looking forward to having connected devices so that we can update the software over the air.
Okay, any other questions? No one? Someone else? I have a question. How, you come from the educational space, so how much, how different was it to go in a classroom and teach about this to actually doing it and you know, feeling the pain on your own flesh?
It's a good question. Probably one of the biggest differences is the speed with which we go. So there is no there's no incentive to go fast in academia unless you're trying to hit a paper deadline. And that actually always drove me crazy. Things are super slow. And we can't afford that. Like, we have to go fast. I actually really love that, but it's definitely one of the biggest differences. I mean, the other is, like anything, you do everything when you start a company, right? You do everything yourself. And so before I was running large research teams, and you know, the work gets distributed, and that doesn't happen anymore. Like, we do everything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm asking because it's always, I see all these teachers talking about entrepreneurship, people that haven't done it. And so I always wonder, if you went back now to teaching, would you change some of the things you've been teaching, or would you be, you know, coherent with what you've been teaching for 20 years?
So I can't imagine going back to doing what I was doing before. So let me just say that. But certainly if I did, I would do it differently. So I did have to teach one last class, which was one night a week, a couple months ago. And it's being recorded, so I'll be moderate in my statements. But
we can take this part off, don't worry.
Yeah, okay, let's take this part off. I kind of phoned it in. It was not my best class. But what I did do is it was a theory class. I was talking literally a theory, and I was talking about how theory informed what we do with the company. And so that was really fun for me. And actually, students loved hearing that, more so than I expected. So, I mean, I might just do more of that and use the company as a case study for why the things we teach are important. But we don't teach entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is very often taught by people who have never built a company, which I don't really understand how that works. But I'm not in charge.
Any final questions? No? Well, Beth, thank you very much for your talk. Thank you guys very much for your questions and for being here.